Good morning. On this very cold January day, I'm joining you from Copenhagen, where it is threatening to snow, and it's about -2 degrees. So if you would like to pop in the chat where you are joining from, it would be lovely to get a bit of a feel for where you're all at. My name's Ferguson. I'm the Director of Consulting at Sums Consulting, and I am going to be chairing today's webinar, which I've been very excited about. We have organised this webinar to share some of the key big points of our report, which you'll be familiar with, because that's why you're here, University Lands, Mapping Risks and Opportunities for the UK Higher Education Sector, which we published back in September, so it's very last year. We're also going to give a demo of the mapping tool to show the various ways that it can be used and what it can show. And we are joined by a wonderful panel who have kindly agreed to share their perspectives on the report and its strategic insights for the universities and the sector. So let me introduce our speakers to you. Our first speaker will be Tom Owen-Smith, who will introduce the report from our side. Tom is one of our principal consultants at Sums, and he's supported institutions across the sector to embed sustainability, societal impact, and cross-sector partnerships into their mission and strategy and operations, and Tom is one of the report's authors. The other author is Phillips, who will do our walkthrough of the mapping tool. Will is a data analyst in our data and insights team, and his areas of focus include environmental risk analysis, data modelling, and sustainability solutions for the HE sector. And he's really our geospatial wizard in this work. And then we have our panel members. It's an honour to have you with us today. Thank you very much. We've got Nick Hillman, who is the Director of Higher Education Policy Institute since 2014, prior to which he worked in the Department for Business Innovation and Skills as a special advisor to David Willetts, MP, now Lord Willetts, when he was the Minister for Universities and Science. And Nick is a well-known commentator across HE policy questions. Then we've got Charlotte Bonner, who is the CEO of EAUC, the Environmental Association for Universities and Colleges, a role that she took up in February 2023. Charlotte has many years of leadership experience across membership and tertiary education organisations, where she's focused on business development, transformational engagement, policy and advocacy. And we in Sums also do a lot of our work together through our strategic partnership with EAUC, through which we run our sustainability consulting services. And last but not least, we've got Donna Lyndsay, who is the CEO and founder of The True Position. She has decades of experience in geospatial data, earth observation and environmental sectors, leading innovation-focused product and communication strategies across industry, government and startups. And her work spans environment, energy and adaptation, backed by deep stakeholder engagement expertise and a global network. And Donna will bring her perspectives on some of the untapped potential for geospatial data. Thank you all for joining us today. So just a little bit of housekeeping for you all. We'll start out with an introduction to the report and the mapping tool from Tom and Willie, followed by some opening remarks from our speakers. But we want to leave enough good time for discussion and questions from the audience as well. So at the top of your screens, you will see both a chat button and a Q&A button. The Q&A function will be open, so if you have a question you'd like to be put to the speakers, please can you put them in the Q&A and we'll feed them through to the speakers. But the chat function is open as well. We'd love to hear where you're joining us from, but also for any general discussion or points that you want to make, feel free to use the chat function. But any speaker questions, please put those through the Q&A. And we'll have some final remarks from our speakers at the end as well. We're really looking forward to this session with you. Thank you for joining us. Without further ado, Tom, over to you.
Thanks very much, Aya. Hopefully my mic is on and everything technical is working well. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. Before I talk about the main kind of takeaways of the work, I'm just going to start by saying something about what we were aiming to achieve and I guess the process that we went through to create this. So Willie and I started out work on this around a year and a half ago, and our aim in doing this was to bring to bear geospatial analysis for new perspectives for universities in the HE sector, and we were guided by the questions: how could the data available help higher education providers know more about the strategic dimensions of their estates, and what in this data would be most useful to higher education stakeholders, which includes both individual HE providers and the sector as a whole. So what we found was a small universe of disparate data sets held in many different places, most of which cover the whole country or even the world, not just university estates. So the breakthrough that we made, and I give Willie's credit for this, was to be able to isolate the boundaries of university estates using data from OpenStreetMap. And once we had that, we were able to overlay a range of geographical data sets for different perspectives. And this is the first time that these data sets have been brought together in one place. So for publication, we went for an interactive online format. And at this point, I'm just going to start sharing some slides. So to take this up again, we went for an interactive online format, which is the screenshot from that here, and the mapping tool, which Willie will walk us through shortly, is really designed so that users can explore questions that matter to them. So for our analysis, we boiled everything down to 4 strategic themes, and each of these themes is one part of the report. Those themes, as you can see here, are the state of the sector and its land, risks, opportunities and value. And you could say that these start from, I guess, the most literal themes and move towards the most exploratory towards the end. Wherever we could, we looked at these themes from the perspective of individual institutions and at the aggregate level. And our data sets cover not quite the whole of the HE sector, but they do cover a fairly large part of it. And we made a set of recommendations in the report, which are in the executive summary, including 2 recommendations to institutions themselves, 2 recommendations to HE sector level stakeholders, and 2 recommendations to policymakers. So we wanted to bring out also examples of where universities are already engaging with these questions, what resources are available for guidance, and particularly where sector guidance exists from organisations like EAUC, ORD and so on. So what were the main insights? I'm going to rattle through those fairly rapidly as I can manage, and I'm going to try to cover each of the main parts in the report in 1 minute or maybe slightly more than that. So let's see if I can manage that. So moving into, first of all, the state of the sector's land, our first data set. The estates of the UK's universities that we mapped cover in the region of about 6,390 hectares, slightly more. That's just around 1/4% of the UK's land surface, but it equates to a town the size of Guildford, Chesterfield or Stirling. So, you know, reasonably material depending on your viewpoint. And importantly, we know that a lot of really important economic activity happens in this area. So the first thing we mapped is how land is used, and we boiled this down to 4 main categories, which you'll see on here. And the highly built nature of the HE estates lands comes out when we compare this to general land use across the UK. HE core estates, so the area that we mapped, they don't contain farmland, which covers around 50% of UK land, and they have slightly less tree cover than the UK as a whole, and markedly a lot of grass at around 30%. We also used machine learning to develop a typology of institutions based on their land use profiles. This identified 3 clusters of institutions, each of which stands out for possessing a higher proportion of one of the 3 core land use types, which are built, grass and trees, above the other 2 clusters. And you can see here what a typical member of each cluster looks like in terms of its land use, how many institutions are in each cluster and so on. And those clusters are significant when we come to look at the opportunities lower down. So the next section was around risks. And in this section, we wanted to explore how exposed universities are to different climate and environmental risks and what they can do about that. So we looked at the risk profiles for different institutions related to 2 areas that are particularly linked to their estates and location: flood risk and heat risk. And you'll see on this kind of aggregate map here, the chart that we've got, that this really varies substantially from place to place, and some of those institutions kind of in the top right have got a really high proportions of their estates with a high risk exposure to both heat and flood, but of course institutions have a range of profiles in there on those axes. So of course you never know how risks are going to materialise. Just looking back on the last couple of months, we've had a number of extreme weather events in the UK in the form of winter storms, and we know that extreme weather events and the associated loss and damage, as well as danger to people, are going to increase as the world's climate warms. So we did some modelling to estimate the potential loss and damage due to flood events and heat waves in pretty plausible climate scenarios for a few decades out from now. These estimate around £167 million of annual damage to universities' infrastructure. And of course, with that, we have disruption to business, we have disruption to important economic activities and so on. And we'll also be seeing rising insurance costs for these assets, and some of the most exposed assets may even become uninsurable over those kind of timeframes. So this is pretty challenging. In the report, we've referred to guidance around understanding climate risks and how to adapt to them, how to build resilience and lower the future impacts. These include materials from the UK government, from the HE sector resources, and cases of institutions which have already been doing this work too. The next section is around opportunities, and we know that universities have a large range of things which they're aiming to achieve on the one hand, and face a range of challenges around efficiency, costs, energy, and so on the other hand. So here we wanted to explore how institutions might be able to use their land differently to move the dial on some of these questions. And we looked at a set of opportunities around this, which is not all of the plausible opportunities, but was what we could kind of feasibly cover in the time period. We looked at the potential of different university sites for generating renewable energy through solar and wind power. You'll see on this chart that there's actually quite a range of potential of some sites are much sunnier or windier than others are. And then there's the question of whether suitable land would be available, whether that's built estate, free grassland with no other use, and so on. And that speaks back to that typology that I highlighted a couple of slides ago. So individual institutions could use this as an initial pointer towards thinking about, would this be worth it at all given our conditions? And if those do look broadly favourable, then that can pave the way for more detailed feasibility work, engagement, planning work, and so on. And again, we wanted to think about what this could mean at the aggregate level and how material this really is. So we used some assumptions to model what impact that could have if 10% of universities' built land was equipped with solar energy installations. We estimated that this could generate nearly 3% of the sector's total energy usage and could save to the tune of around 40 million per year on energy bills. This doesn't consider the costs and the challenges of actually installing this infrastructure, but that does seem to be a fairly material movement there. Another point that we'd bring out here is that the infrastructure is not just a technical question. The grid is decarbonising substantially over the next decade, and the UK's energy systems will be more decentralised around local and regional systems. We know that universities are major economic players, and I'd say there are some pretty substantial opportunities here for partnership with industry and other regional stakeholders, especially in areas that have got combined mayoral authorities. Those could be around applied research, knowledge exchange, or skills agendas, all of which are, really part of university's core mission. So it's not just here about kind of technical interventions. HEI's role in regional development is brought out really strongly in recent kind of policy agenda, and we see that coming through in documents like the post-16 education skills white paper, how that links to the industrial strategy, and there are various funding streams available for regional partnership and development also. So we also mapped the potential for forestation and situated that in the forestation being kind of replanting of forests, expanding the area under trees, and we situated those in wider discussions around maintaining and restoring biodiversity. This is quite topical actually, as just this week the government has published an assessment of the national security risks around biodiversity loss, and this leads us on to the last section. So the last section, which focused on value, bring that up. As I said at the start, this is the most exploratory part of the report, and here we were looking to explore the status quo as well as emerging opportunities around biodiversity and healthy ecosystems. So the framework that we used is called natural capital. That's an approach that seeks to reflect the value of ecosystem services such as clean air, water, climate regulation, which nature supplies for us free of charge and which aren't well accounted for in traditional accounting systems. The UK actually does have account for this in a national framework called the UK Natural Capital Accounts, which is run by the Office for National Statistics. We aligned our approach and our calculations with that, and this also docks into an international environmental accounting frameworks which are overseen by the UN. The important thing to note here is that this value is distinct from commercial land value, although over time in the future, it might come to be more reflected in that. So with the UK accounts as a benchmark, we look to assess what the ecosystem services supplied by university estates are and how these might be priced. And we develop some estimates for these at the whole data set level, which you'll see here. You can estimate that, you can see here that we estimated the total asset value of the university's natural capital at around £250 million. This chart here, which I'll just bring up, shows how different land use types have got different profiles of ecosystem services which they supply well or badly. That's whether the bars are kind of adding value going up or decreasing value going down, and how that manifests in different ways for the environment and for kind of for people. Also, to pull out an example on here, we can see that trees have a positive impact on the greenhouse gas regulation as they're drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. So that's in the first side, that kind of dark green bar, which is going upwards. But a lot of the UK's water and wetlands, which could also, if they were in a good condition, could draw down carbon, are actually having the opposite effect because they're in a poor condition. And this is why kind of improving the condition of ecosystems really matters and makes a difference here. So this is already reflected to some degree and starting to be priced through in the UK through mechanisms like the biodiversity net gain legislation. And I think it's likely to see this develop further over time as nature markets become more mature. As I say, this is the most exploratory part of the work. And we hope that this can give some pointers to institutions around that haven't thought about, those institutions that haven't thought about it yet, as we know that many have, around where they could start out. So to sum up, what we want to highlight here is that universities, land and estates really do speak to a whole range of strategic questions, whether those are around managing risks and costs, whether those are around developing new opportunities which speak to core mission, or around making contributions to sustainability, which will bring benefit to the institutions themselves and to society. So that is the end of my rattle through now, and I will now hand over to Willie to show us the mapping
Thanks
tool.
very much, Tom. That's fabulous. Lots of food for thought there for our panel to comment on in a bit, but first over to Willie the Wizard.
Let me know when you've got me up here.
Yeah, we've got it.
Oh, good. All right. Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I would love to take this chance to walk you through the online version of this tool. So there's the text-based report, and then we also have an interactive tool that just sums everything up and makes it all very click and point and accessible. I'm going to walk through this from the perspective of Harper Adams University because I found their land use profile to be particularly interesting, and I think it tells a nice story. So I'll walk through in the way that I would suggest and that we have envisioned people will walk through this. So as Tom said, it's broken down into these 4 parts. As you'd expect, we can start on part number 1. They all follow the same structure. So what are your key takeaways at a high level? What you as an institution could do with that information? And then what more generally, how to contextualize yourself within the sector and maybe from the perspective of a policymaker. And as Tom mentioned, this all comes from this current setting where the government has really prioritized this effort to remove silos and to increase communication and regional partnerships to foster this idea of efficient land use. And so this tool, it might not solve every problem, but if we could start enabling the conversation just by making the data available, that for us feels like a big success. So moving on through the tool, you land at what could be kind of an intimidating scene, but this just gives backing to what Tom was referencing earlier with our land use clusters. So as you mentioned, we use machine learning to group up our universities, and we can get into that more later if you desire. But basically, they all fall into 3 different groups. And that becomes quite significant as you start thinking about what opportunities might be valuable or accessible for you as a university. So you could go through, find yourself here, Harper Adams, and see that they are in cluster 2 because of their dominant grass coverage. And so a main motivation with this is to just try and make these visuals interactive and visually stimulating in a way that unlocks some of this data that is available and is publicly open sourced, but can require a lot of tinkering and manipulation to get it to work for you. Now, if you go into our second part of part 1 here, you can actually break down institutional land use by type. So this is, again, it's all open source data. Come down to Harper Adams, and you can see that there's a very interesting profile coming out of grass. This kind of grass dominance and urban kind of competition going on. And if we look at actually the Google Maps version of this university, you can see, yeah, that looks about right. There's some tree coverage and some grass, and maybe even some farmlands included on there. And so all to say that the data is maybe not going to be perfect in every single inch and centimeter, but it does give you a really good representation of what's going on the ground. And this is kind of the first time this is all put together in one place. So I think it's, again, it can be a little intimidating, but with a little bit of time spent digging around, I think it can be quite useful. So once you've understood what your institution looks like from this macro perspective and coming from the satellite down, that opens up 2 avenues of your risks and your opportunities. And we've laid all of that here. And after you've kind of understood your position, we would recommend going into our risks column and really start to understand what's going on in that category. So again, we have a collection for all of our 174 universities that we found data for. All of them can be found on this map, and we've tried to make it as simple as possible, just finding your area, clicking on it, and getting an idea for what the data is saying. So this is all heat risk data. Again, we could get into this later, but basically how warm is your campus compared to the areas around it that are not urban. And so this gives a good idea for what your kind of spectral signature looks like. And it's quite a fascinating thing that I will not talk about right now in great detail, but again, it can be quite powerful to think about how you structure your land use when you can understand how it holds on to heat and how that might change in a warming climate. And again, as we think about that land use pattern, the heat risk and the kind of the land use signature, they do start to mirror each other. And so it's quite cool to see how these things overlap. Moving on through the tool, the biggest, I think, barrier to the hardest data to access, in my opinion, comes down to precipitation and other climatological data. And I'm an extremely visual learner, and I think that the power of geospatial data lies within these type of visuals, within these maps. And part of our remit to really bring this tool to life was to make these visuals accessible and not only paint a pretty picture, but really to hopefully make it so that you could just look and at a glance understand what the situation is on the ground. And again, it follows a similar methodology. You can click and find your university and hopefully feel that you could, in a moment, understand at least what the situation looks like. And that goes for not just our observed patterns of precipitation and temperature, but also falls on to our predicted future climate settings. And so all the data comes from Met Office and UK climate projections. So we used everything that was current as of the making of this report. And it's quite, the color coding is basically all you need to understand. So once you've understood the scale that you're looking at, everything else becomes quite apparent. So, okay, changes to winter precipitation, 2 degrees of warming. These are largely accepted climate scenarios for 2 degrees and 4 degrees. And you can just start to see how there are slight differentiations in color intensity in some of these areas. And that's basically from this type of data, that's really all we need to know at this moment, that some areas are going to be impacted more or less than others. So as we've understood our risks and our current situation and our climate within this climatological data, you can just start to build a bit of an understanding without doing a master's degree and without really bogging down in the details what the situation might look like for your institution. And so once we
speed
move
up a little
on,
bit, Willie, to get to
sorry.
the panel.
Yeah. And so I'll end on a nice note of our opportunities. With every risk comes an opportunity, and we've done the exact same form of mapping for that, where every institution mapped again against their solar and their wind opportunities. And I'll leave it at that for now. And of course, if there's any questions, we can address those at another time. But thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Willie. Hopefully, as you can see, there's lots and lots of stuff to delve into, and we could probably talk to you for several hours about it. But I want to give an opportunity for our panels to give their thoughts on this stuff. So I've got a few questions to kick off with, but do pop anything in the Q&A function if you've got something that you want to ask as well. Nick, let me come to you first. If I were a university executive team or board, what would I be interested in from this report? How could I use it to bring value or new perspectives to my institution?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And just to say, as a sort of precursor, I think this is a really, really important piece of work. I mean, the most interesting bits of work in higher education are ones that put into the public domain information and intelligence and encourage conversations that should be happening but are not happening. And because there hasn't been an initiative of this sort, to the best of my knowledge, ever before, I think it does absolutely allow, as you say, conversations to happen that might not otherwise happen. And just to answer your question sort of specifically, I mean, I think it changes the nature of the conversation about what place-based higher education is. So there's been for many years, people have been talking about university civic role and how important that is and how that should be rejuvenated. But I think this puts a different sort of spin on what we mean by place-based when we're talking about higher education, because very often what people mean by that is how integrated are they with their local community, what support are they giving local employers, local people, local charities, local arts facilities. But this puts a sort of different spin on it, really. It talks about the geographical features of the university and the place-based nature in that sense, and of course then allows you to have a conversation about all sorts of other things like energy use, like renewable energy, like changing the use of facilities. It also reminds me, when I read the report, and I've read many drafts and then the final version as well, of the diversity of our sector. So often journalists ring me up and say, what do you think about this? And they sort of want a really simplistic answer that the sector does this or thinks that. Whereas actually what we have is a very varied sector. And of course, you're limited by the data that exists. And so you haven't even captured every single higher education provider. But within the ones that you've got, it shows, there's a big difference between urban universities and rural universities, between campus-based universities and ones that are more spread out, between coastal institutions that are, let's say at the end of train lines, and ones that are not, between small ones and big ones. And I think it reminds us, therefore, of the diversity of the sector. And I am a board member myself. I mean, one of the things that I was struck by, I'm a board member of the smallest university in the country that's been going through some interesting times, Buckingham University. It's my local university. It's close to where I'm talking to you from today. And when I last drove there for a meeting, I couldn't park in the normal car park because it was flooded. The River Ouse had overflooded. And actually, when I look at your data for the University of Buckingham, I see the University of Buckingham is at great risk of flooding. And I certainly, as a board member, will be flagging that in my next board meeting. I've been on the board for 7 or 8 years, so I'll soon be leaving it. And I can't remember us ever having a detailed conversation about the risk of the campus to flooding, but I will certainly be making sure that's on the agenda of a future board meeting. And then I know we don't have long each, but just a couple of other quick points. I think my original expectation on reading it was maybe I would end up with the conclusion that universities should divest themselves of large tracts of land because, there's more online learning. There's a reduction in the number of 18-year-olds. There's, various things you might think. There's net zero targets. And if you can offload your inefficient buildings, you get close to your net zero targets. So I thought maybe initially I would read the report and think, oh, universities should read this and then sell off lots of bits of land. And it wasn't actually my conclusion, and partly because of the way you've written up the results, which reminds us of some of the alternative uses of some of this land, even if it continues to be owned by universities, and also how broad-based universities are. So universities themselves could be providing their own energy sources. Universities always can do more in the knowledge transfer space. There's always more that one could be done as research budgets hopefully increase in future, to have big research facilities, for example. And of course, this week's education export strategy from the government actually wants universities to increase their estates, only to do so abroad by taking foreign campuses and getting even bigger that way through far more transnational education. So I thought that was an interesting sort of thought prompted to me by that. And then finally, and I'm sorry to end on a negative because I'm a pretty optimistic person and I normally like to end on a positive, but finally there is, I mean, it's a wonderful piece of work, and those of us in higher education should never be afraid of evidence, but we should just remember that some policymakers who dislike our sector might look at this and regard it almost like the Doomsday Book. You know, William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book was to work out who the hell he could tax and get a whole load of extra money from. Henry VIII's, I think, was called Valor Ecclesiasticus, where they looked at the wealth of the monasteries, was there to look at what they could then pinch from the monasteries and the dissolution of the monasteries. And of course, there will be people, given the political environment in which we're living, and God, well, HEPI is a politically neutral organisation, but the world will look different if we end up with a reform government. And I do think we just need to think about the consequences of some of this work being misinterpreted and people thinking, golly, aren't universities wealthy? Haven't they got lots of resources that we can use for other purposes? And I just think that needs to be part of this wider conversation as well. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Nick. Lots of food for thought there, and look forward to hearing how you get on with the board when you share this with them. Right. The next question I've got is for you, Charlotte, and it comes out quite clearly in the report how important university estates are in their agendas for sustainability. Through EAUC, you have sight of this across a very large range of the sector. Why does this matter from your perspective? How do you think it relates to sort of current questions that a lot of institutions are focusing on?
Well, firstly, good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you, including some long-standing EAUC members on the call. I think it's very clear that estates aren't just the land that institutions own, that they've put some buildings on to do the work that they do, but they're actually a really key enabler of that core purpose of institutions, teaching, learning, research, public engagement, community, societal value. So they're not just the host of that work, they are an enabling function of it. And I think this is something that intersects with many other elements of what an institution delivers. And Nick, it's really interesting to hear your reflections as a governor in terms of the questions that this report has sparked. And I think firstly, we need to think about just the credibility of the sector in terms of the real basics. Can an institution keep people safe and well if it's overheating, if it's flooded? Can it keep teaching and research running? Can it protect its assets as the climate changes and we witness more extreme weather and our natural systems are degrading? So this really is about risk management and about mitigation of those risks in the face of overheating and flooding and disruption and the knock-on impacts that has on staff and student experience. So the mapping that's been undertaken by SUMS really helps because it makes those risks tangible, and especially where those hazards kind of overlap with the built estate and that core activity. But I think it goes beyond kind of the nuts and bolts, will we be open next time it rains? And I think we can start to ask questions about how institutions show that they're using their land and their buildings really imaginatively and responsibly, and not just decarbonising what already exists or, as Nick has said, kind of selling off bits of land, but using the estate as an active platform for impact. And that might look like community energy projects, it might look like renewables paired with biodiversity, it might look like regenerative land management, it might look like campus living labs that support research and teaching, or it might be designing outdoor teaching and engagement and wellbeing spaces that benefit both campus and the campus's community. So done well, I think land use becomes a really solid way of demonstrating leadership, of enhancing and enabling the core functions of an institution and fundamentally delivering what the higher education sector is there to deliver. The bulk of our work with SUMS really at the moment, not necessarily in the future, has been about net zero and about carbon integrity. And it is very easy for the land conversation to drift, I think, into kind of quick fixes, because of course land can absolutely contribute to net zero positively through renewables and in some cases through sequestration, so tree planting, peatland restoration, so on and so forth. But I think it needs to sit within a clear hierarchy, and we're still at the stage where the sector needs to cut emissions at source first and then use high integrity removals for kind of genuinely residual emissions, whether that's through offsetting through a programme like the Carbon Coalition or using your land more responsibly. So more land doesn't necessarily mean a smaller footprint, but it's something to really consider. I think also there's a strong link to the social elements of an institution and the well-being agenda, particularly green and blue spaces, shade, comfort, opportunities for movement and social contact, connection with nature. You know, they aren't peripheral really, they shape whether our campuses are healthy, inclusive, supportive, thriving places, and they can support engagement and belonging both within and beyond the institution's wall. And I think that's particularly important at the moment when so many of our members are restructuring and reorganising. You know, those spaces create opportunities to keep social capital strong and healthy. And of course the context is tight. You know, we know we've got tight budgets, limited capacity, maintenance backlogs, uncertainty for the future for some institutions. So I think there's also something here about prioritisation, and it's so easy when institutions are constrained by kind of short-term urgent priorities to miss opportunities for really long-term wins. So I think there's a piece here about decision making and about choices and about making sure that we're prioritising the right things so that we are really maximising the use of our estate, not just so we have the right number of car parks or it looks pretty when parents come on open days, but so that our spaces are really effective for learner outcomes and experience, for business continuity, for professional services functionality, as well as those kind of core functions of teaching and learning. So I'll finish just by saying it's really tempting to, I think, defer ambition, but this is exactly where getting land and estates decisions matter most. They matter for resilience, they matter for value, they matter for alignment with the strategic goals that our members have set around sustainability. And I strongly believe that short-term financial pressure shouldn't pause those decisions, but actually really makes them more essential in terms of making smart and prioritised estates choices. And we'll come on to further discussion later on.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Charlotte. And yes, it'll be interesting to see whether the shape and type of support that we do together for the sector, whether that will change as a result of this, whether we'll get to do some work on the back of this, whether it starts to open up some of those discussions will be very interesting. And yeah, absolutely. Last but not least, Donna. So this is our first major piece of geospatial work in SUMS, but you've been doing work in that space for a long time. So what kinds of perspectives and opportunities can geospatial data offer universities and decision makers?
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me along. I am the outlier here, so I'm not actually within the university system, but I have worked a lot with universities in the past. And I think what's been really powerful about this piece of work is actually, it's been articulated by Willie and Tom actually, is that ability to visualize very, very complex data. This data is not easy to handle. And actually, if you see it in research reports and you see it in spreadsheets and all that sort of stuff, you know, it's almost impenetrable for most people to understand. And I think what's really powerful about the use of geospatial data, particularly within this form of analysis, is actually, as Willie says, you don't need a PhD to interpret it. You can see the colour differentiation, and that means it's accessible to everybody. Okay, and I think that's really, really important when you particularly look at it from a strategic point of view. And I think geospatial analysis is actually one of our most underutilized capabilities we have right across the country. We are really strong in this, but it's very siloed. And the work that Willie's been doing is really about how do we utilize some of these new capabilities like machine learning, AI analytics, generative AI, etc., to pull together all these disparate sources of information to give us that overview, to help us make these core strategic decisions as to what are those opportunities, what are those fundamental risks that we are facing that actually we can deal with, you know. And I was really interested in what Nick was saying about, like, oh, now we can see it, we're a bit worried. You know, and that's the power of these things. You know, you can start unpacking where those particular issues are and actually start counteracting them. You know, I've seen that over my long duration in geography, if you like, of people not wanting to know, because once they know, they feel they've got to do something about it. And that's quite right. Once you can see it really clearly, you start really understanding where those vulnerabilities are. And of course, I work with a lot with industry. They have exactly the same issues, and they have real issues with bringing together disparate sources of information and data from different sort of business units. Everybody does everything slightly differently. So, you know, universities could have a really core functionality there of helping people actually, you know, aggregate this information, bringing it together in an appropriate way to enable these type of visualizations. That's one sort of aspect. But I think also, you know, you've got to bear in mind that there are new things coming down the line that this type of research is going to be really important for. So you've got the new statements coming out from the Bank of England. So the PRA SS 525, I think it's called, came out the end of last year. And that's talking about, you know, banks and insurance companies, etc., really understanding their climate risks in terms of their portfolios. So they are looking at understanding, you know, what are their physical risks in terms of their investments, their litigation risks, and their transition risks. So they are looking not only at the risks across their portfolios, but the opportunities to invest to de-risk too. And this piece of research sits squarely into that. If banks and institutions and insurance are looking at that across their portfolios, you can start saying, actually, guys, we've got a real opportunity for investment here. You know, or you can really start understanding, you know, are we vulnerable to some litigation in terms of, you know, people being exposed to heat, you know, people exposing to flood risks, etc., etc. What can we do to counteract these things now before it's too late? Okay, so I think there's a number of really important things that are going on institutionally and industry-wide. They're actually beginning to look at these type of questions. And of course, we all know the power of a map and how it can influence everybody. You only need to look at Greenland for a start. You know, these things are really fundamental, and we actually need to start thinking about these things in a spatial context of how we can actually start utilizing land and strategy and policies in a really appropriate way that actually can deal with some of these big sort of geo-economic questions that we have.
Brilliant. Thanks, Donna. That is really interesting. Although I have to say, as a Dane coming to you from Copenhagen, don't even go there about Greenland right now, frankly. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. Tom, if I could just get you to talk about commissioning this work first.
So that's a question from Fraser Lovey. Hopefully my mic is on again, who's asked us, just wondering who commissioned the work. And well, the answer is actually nobody commissioned it. We just did that. We started on this piece ourselves in sums, and I guess the purpose behind it was really for impact for the sector, and because we find it intellectually stimulating and, you know, exciting to do this kind of work. One of the things which was amazing about doing this piece was that we engaged with, you know, really a lot of expert stakeholders and kind of sector voices that really helped to kind of sharpen and refine its value and its relevance to you know, hopefully institutions themselves and sector level stakeholders and policymakers as well. So that's a bit of the story behind the piece. And I realise that other question, Aya, probably is more for us than the speakers as well. So happy to take that one quickly, which is where Alexandra Stewart has asked if we've got plans to basically review this and increase and improve the detail of what we've got around biodiversity data and around kind of the boundaries of the estates delineated in the work. So I guess to the first of those, it's kind of watch this space potentially, because this does take quite a lot of time to actually compute all of this data. So I guess our view on that is that, you know, we've been really happy to put this out and great to generate these discussions around it. If there would be other stakeholders in the sector that would also be keen to kind of take steps around that, maybe partner, maybe can think around ways that we could work together around it and share that load, we'd be absolutely interested to talk to people about it. About the boundaries, so we drew the estate boundaries here from OpenStreetMap. So it's a public open source data set, and we basically went with what we could get on there because that was the best reference source that we could go to, short of going to every institution's kind of detailed land records, which probably wouldn't be in a
geospatial visual format in any case. So if the boundaries are wrong for your institution, our line on that is the thing to do is get in touch with OpenStreetMap and kind of review and revision those boundaries there. So thanks for the questions. We're happy to take more, or for the speakers as well.
Thanks, Tom. And yeah, and just on the commissioning, yeah, we want to do good for the sector, and we happen to have a secret weapon in Willie who has this amazing ability to visualize stuff, and out of that has come amazing stuff. Okay, keep the questions coming in the Q&A box if you would like to ask anything of our panel, but I have a question maybe coming back to you, Nick. So we've talked a bit about the sort of potential and possibilities here, but of course we all know about the current challenges that a lot of UK's universities are facing, and more broadly the state of the sector. So in these conditions, we know that money is short, a lot of leadership bandwidth is understandably focused on quite immediate challenges. Given all of that, is it realistic that universities spend time on the kinds of questions that we're looking at here? Should they be doing that? What are the risks of not doing it?
Actually, I think, yeah, I think it makes it more important that they do this, because you're absolutely right. They can say we've got 1,000,001 other things to worry about. But actually, I think it makes it more important, not less important, that they understand their estate. For example, running an estate costs a lot of money, but also provides, as your report shows, all sorts of new potential opportunities. You know, maybe you can produce enough energy and feed some back into the grid, or whatever it might be, or you know, do more things in the, you know, with local employers related to the local economy, or, you know, whatever it might be. I mean, it's going to be a different answer for every university. But I actually think at this moment, it makes it more important to do that. And the other thing I would say, and again, there's a lot of this in the report, is of course a lot of universities have net zero targets that are very bold, and they're nowhere near being on track for them. You know, some of them, they thought this was going to be quite easy because they adopted a net zero target a little bit before COVID, and then their carbon output did go down a lot during COVID. So it looked like they were on track from the straight line on the graph, and now they suddenly realize they're miles off track again. They're not going to get anywhere near their net zero targets. So universities' concerns are not just about financial targets, they're also around things like net zero targets, which, as I say, typically they're miles off. You know, and this just helps them answer those sorts of questions. I mean, it's brilliant because it's using pre-existing data in really original ways.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. And I wonder whether maybe building on that, Charlotte, if I come to you. So we talked about net zero and some of those ambitions there. And here at SUMS, we do a lot of work around universities' whole institution strategy and making sustainability a strategic driver. And I know that you do a lot around this at EAUC too. And we also do it together through our strategic partnership. What's your view on how sustainability is a strategic differentiator for HEIs, both now, but also in the future?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think this is changing over time. You know, I think a strong sustainability narrative has been a differentiator for many institutions for a long time. It's been a kind of clear USP for a subset of institutions who are early movers, who are visibly investing, who are really committed strategically to the sustainability agenda, who are willing to lead publicly. But I do think that that's shifting, it's changing. Sustainability is increasingly becoming normalised as a priority, as it should be. And without giving too many spoilers away, we've got a report coming out next month, our first State of the Sector report for some time, which is really reinforcing that direction of travel. So the differentiator is changing shape. It's less kind of, do you have a strategy? Do you have a commitment to sustainability? And more, are you delivering? Are you delivering at the pace and scale that's commensurate with climate and biodiversity science? Are you being open and transparent and credible about the progress that you're making, the trade-offs that you're having to navigate? Are you making hard choices that don't deprioritise sustainability when you've got a competing portfolio of things to consider? And I think some institutions will still choose and be able to be like really cutting edge and pushing innovation in the sustainability space, and that will be part of their DNA and their culture and their ethos. But at the same time, I think the bigger system impact comes from raising the floor. So not just lifting the ceiling, but raising the floor. So making sure that every institution has the capability and the expectation to meet kind of a higher baseline when it comes to sustainability performance, which will make it less of a differentiator because it is a norm that the sector delivers. And that's something we'll have to navigate in terms of kind of attracting students, in terms of that compelling and kind of transparent narrative about what sustainability means for an institution. But from an EAUC perspective, and in our partnership with SUMS, kind of that's where shared tools, data and insights like this report, peer learning and practical support really matter alongside our policy and advocacy work, because fundamentally we want to reduce duplication, we want to spread what works, we want to encourage collaboration and collegiality between sector bodies, and making kind of good enough easier to achieve, while still creating that space for the pioneers and the innovators to really test what next, and to keep that as a differentiator.
Brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. We've got a question from Fraser, who says, have the panel got any thoughts on separate research around sort of wider estate issues? So this work on climate risk is great, but maybe this level of focus on more traditional estates concerns, such as aging buildings, asset values, backlot maintenance. I'll put that open to the panel if anybody's got any thoughts.
I could say something very briefly about that, which is that our colleagues over at the Association of University Directors of Estates, also known as AUD, do a lot of work around various of those questions. I'm not quite sure if every single thing of those will have been touched on, but of course they publish run the annual data set around the estates management record, and were really helpful as a kind of discussant, engaging with us around the questions that we looked at in this piece. So again, Fraser, I would say if that's something which is of particular interest, and there's maybe kind of a coalition in the sector of maybe a number of institutions that would find that work particularly valuable, and we could maybe get a group together to do some work around it, we would be very, very much up for kind of taking that conversation forward. So if it's of interest, let's have a chat after the meeting and see what the potential could be there.
Yeah, I concur with that. Can I add just a tiny thing, which is looking at some of the conversations that are happening at an institution level are also happening at a centralised level. So at the moment there's quite disparate reporting on issues relating to estates and sustainability across the sector, and we know that reporting burden is something that is a challenge to our members. But there's really positive messaging coming from the Department for Education and their work with DESNES around how they're seeing those kind of condition data sets aligning more strongly with sustainability data sets in future. So covering exactly what Fraser's mentioned there. So there's an appetite coming from different parts of the sector, I think, but I would concur with Tom, and it's definitely something that EAUC would be happy to contribute to.
Brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. I've got just one last question before we start to wrap up. So we talked a bit about policy and strategy and so on. Donna, if we sort of think about some of the important policy documents with relevance to universities, such as the post-16 education and skills white paper that Tom mentioned earlier, or the UK's modern industrial strategy, we can see that there's quite a strong geographical dimension around some of the regional clustering for industry, innovation and skills and so on. Why do you think that geospatial data hasn't been more used around some of these agendas up to date?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. And they have tried to use it to a degree, but it tends to be very generalized. So people tend to look at it, as a region block rather than within region. And I think that's one of the really powerful things that this research demonstrates, is actually if we can get to that level of granularity that enables us to make the right decisions in the right locations, that actually supports that region in terms of innovation, investment, and the security, the energy and social and economic and environmental securities that we all need within those regions. I think that's when it becomes really, really powerful, and it's so underutilized. And I think that's partially, like Charlotte says, where people are beginning to think about, well, this over here should be aligning better with this to reduce reporting burdens, and that's something that geographic data can do. If you use the commonality of location to start linking data sets together that are very disparate, or stuck in reports over there, or stuck in this business unit over there, you start getting a much better understanding of actually what's going on, and it starts sort of bringing forward things that just haven't really been seen before because they've been so separate. So I think, that there is a real opportunity now to look at those policy documentations and to say that actually, we have to collaborate. we have to support our regions, we have to demonstrate our value within that region, and geospatial data can really do that in a way that can communicate it right across these different disciplines. And I think that would be a really great way to start really pushing forward, the strength of our research within the UK.
Brilliant. Thanks, Donna. And actually that brings me to my sort of final question that I want to ask to the panel as we wrap up. So if you could give a 30-second answer to this, and I'll come to each of you in turn. Nick, I'll start with you. It's really great to be able to share this with people, but of course our hope from SUMS is that something action comes out of it. So my question is, from your perspective, what is the call to action around what we could do next from this report? And that means either for us as SUMS or for someone in the audience who's inspired and wants to do more following on from this conversation, or even as a higher education sector more broadly. But what do we need to do?
Well, two things. I mean, I think the first is make sure governors and senior executives understand their own estates better than they currently do. And secondly, and this will probably be not what you want to hear, but this needs to be a living thing, because as I travel around the country looking at universities, they are living, changing entities constantly. I met my wife at Manchester University many years ago, and when she went back there recently, she could not find the route from her old hall of residence to where she had her lectures, because the physical geography of the city had changed so much from when she'd been a student there 30 years ago. And so there can't be a snapshot. It has to be a film almost, so we track changes over time.
And I guess equally, universities can't make decisions and strategies based on that one snapshot. They have to keep updating it as well and carrying on. Yeah, thank you. Same question to you, Charlotte.
Yeah, it's always difficult to pin it down to one thing, isn't it, when you've got a piece of research that is useful to different audiences. But I think fundamentally we need to get it in front of the right people so we can move from the insights that have been gathered to informing delivery, and whether that's designing for maximal benefit across an estate, whether that's pushing for clear incentives and funding for adaptation at a policy level. I think we need to get this in front of the right people so that it informs practice. And it would be aside from me to not do a blatant plug, if people want support with that, from moving quickly from mapping to implementation, then the EAUC SUMS Sustainability Consulting Partnership can help.
Brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. Donna?
I think controversially, I think one of the most powerful things, reflecting on what Nick was saying, actually, if this could be the baseline to start a league table of best practice, and that's where governors and the C-suite really pay attention when they see themselves moving up and down that league table. So if you really want to have something that's impactful, that actually starts changing that mindset, then something like that would work. But I would say the key action from all of this, I would suggest, is that look at your university. Look at what this piece of research is telling you, and seeing how you can reinterpret that in terms of opportunities for your university to actually do some appropriate action.
Yeah. Thanks, Donna. Tom?
Thanks. So final point for me. So I guess I would say, so we really did design this so as to be as user-friendly and self-service as possible. So would really encourage users, institutions to use that tool and explore it and find out what you want to know and what you can from that. And that might serve as a starting point for you to do, detailed site-specific expectations, kind of feasibility study for renewables, vulnerability assessment for flooding, those kinds of things, or even a natural capital assessment. And that can inform, of course, we've had lots of conversations here around, the strategic conversations, kind of broader estates management, capital planning, and so on. So you hopefully can take that a long way in your institution itself. Can also refer to the sector resources, the kind of national and other resources that we've put in the report too, as kind of food for thought. And then, if you still are thinking, okay, we could do with some additional support around this, or some of those questions could do with working through, then we are here to help. We'd be really happy to talk to you around any of those points. And of course, as Charlotte said, do feel free to get in touch. And Aya's just put a link to the tool in the chat right now, actually. So anybody could go and explore those questions.
So the call to action is go and have a look, go and have a play, because it's really powerful stuff. And then hopefully that will inform some conversations that you can have with colleagues across your institutions. Thank you very much to our panel. It's very much appreciated. It's frustrating we only had an hour because there's a lot more stuff I'd love to get into, but it is the start of a conversation, I think, and it will be really, really interesting to see how the sector receives this and responds to the call to actions that you've put forward today. So thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to all of our attendees. Please let us know how you get on. We've got to keep this conversation going. Take care out there.
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks all.